So the last case we're going to talk about and the last video is Boumediene versus Bush. And this is a 2008 case. So this is already 6 years after people are being held at Guantanamo Bay as being enemy combatants until the war on terror ends. So what you have is after Hamdan, the Supreme Court said the tribunals weren't good enough. And also Congress had said in the future, no one else can sue for habeas corpus. And so what happened after Hamdan was Congress passed another law called the Military Commission Act. And the Military Commission Act said even if you already filed for habeas corpus, you still can't have your case heard here. Even if it's in the middle of being heard, it just stops, that this law is now retroactive. And the Military Commissions Act, there's a lot of other really terrible things that authorize the torture that was going on, all sorts of things, and it's in your reading. So take a look through the whole act. So finally, the Supreme Court had to decide, is this okay? Can you say no habeas corpus for these people, which would mean they wouldn't be able to challenge their conditions of confinement. Now remember, under the US Constitution, the suspension clause, there's a writ of habeas corpus unless Congress decides that it's going to be suspended because there's an invasion or a rebellion going on, and only Congress can decide that. And at this point, Congress had not suspended habeas corpus, so the rule of habeas corpus that you can come to a court and you can say, I want to challenge why I'm being held, I want to know why I'm being held, and I want to challenge that, was still in effect. So what was going on here is the government was saying that these detainees don't have a right to habeas corpus for two reasons. One, because they're enemy combatants, and two, because they're at Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay is in the United States. So the US Constitution applies to anyone who is in the United States. You don't have to be a US citizen as long as you're in the United States. So if I'm a US citizen, I have freedom of speech, but if I'm not a US citizen, if I was a German citizen and I'm in Times Square, I still have the same amount of freedom of speech, okay? So the US Constitution doesn't apply based on if you're a citizen, it applies to anyone who's in the United States. So the government's argument is that Guantanamo Bay is Cuba. It's part of Cuba, owned by Cuba, so we can hold people on Guantanamo Bay and they don't have a right to habeas corpus. They don't have any rights under the Constitution because they're not in the United States. So the Supreme Court says no to this. The Supreme Court says, yes, the Constitution only applies in the United States, but instead of looking legally, is this technically the United States, we're going to look to practically. And practically, Guantanamo Bay is the United States, right? At this point, it had been more than 100 years since the United States had complete control over Guantanamo Bay. Cuba had no control over Guantanamo Bay. The lease was indefinite. Keep in mind that at this point, for 60 years, Cuba had been saying, please leave, this is our land. And the United States had been saying for 60 years at this point, this isn't your land, this is our land. We're leasing it forever. You have no rights here, we only have rights here. So looking to all of that, the Supreme Court said that Guantanamo Bay is the United States. And the court said it's really important to say this because otherwise the government could go do this again. They could go lease land somewhere forever, have it be under the complete control of the United States forever, but then the Constitution just wouldn't apply. And that's not okay, because then you wouldn't have any separation of powers, right? If the executive branch did that, then the president would just get to say what happened from then on, and you wouldn't have a constitution for all these people. And the Constitution is supposed to protect people who are in America. So the Supreme Court said, no, for the purpose of habeas corpus, Guantanamo Bay is in the United States because the government doesn't get to decide where the Constitution applies and doesn't apply, right? The government could say we're setting up this base somewhere else. You know, we lease it, we own it, we have had it for so long, but no constitutional rights here. That'd be very problematic. And secondly, just because he's an enemy combatant doesn't mean he doesn't get habeas corpus review. The Supreme Court says no to those cases. Anyone who's being held should be able to know why they're being held. And so looking into it again, the Supreme Court says that these tribunals aren't enough. In addition to the problems before, there was a presumption that any evidence of the government's was correct. So it started that you're guilty and you could prove otherwise without knowing whether, like, even all the evidence against you. or being able to bring evidence. And so the Supreme Court said you don't necessarily need to have the exact same type of habeas corpus for enemy combatants, right? There are concerns over terrorism, there's concerns over safety here, but at minimum, habeas corpus means that someone who's being held a prisoner has to have meaningful opportunity to be able to demonstrate that law has been applied incorrectly to them. And if they can prove that, that they should be released, right? People should be able to prove that they're not an enemy combatant, for example, and they should be able, once they prove that, to be released or something else. And there could be other solutions here, but you can't just keep people forever anymore. And that was the Boumediene case. So that's where we ended constitutionally on these issues. There's going to be a quiz and a link before this video that I'm going to send out, and comment with any questions. Thanks, everyone.